Right, in this video, I want to complete topic for 2.10, explain the concept of productivity both under micro and macro view. So we're going to do a bit better than that. Instead of just explaining the concept, what I want us to do is to explain it and to understand what can influence it and how it can be relevant in macro and microeconomic models. Productivity is simply defined as well as that's of course where we should start by just giving a definition of productivity. Productivity is essentially the amount of output that we can produce with a given quantity of input resources. So for example, if we, to simplify, let's just focus on one resource at a time. Let's say we take a worker, a construction worker, and a given amount of time, because usually when we talk about productivity, it's usually productivity per hour, per day, per month. So if you are a construction worker and you can lay 200 bricks per day, well, then that's your productivity, okay? That's it. It's the amount of output that can be produced with a given quantity of input. So of course, we can talk about the productivity of labor. We can talk about the productivity of machines, capital equipment. We can talk about the productivity of natural resources. And usually, like I said, it's a certain amount of output per worker, per machine, per hour, or per day. There is always an amount of time that is involved. Right, so let's start with the relevance of productivity in microeconomics and micro. Remember, microeconomics is basically the study of individual economic agents, individual firms, individual consumers, as well as individual markets. So micro means that we take a microscope and instead of looking at how the overall economy functions, we just narrow it down to the behavior of individuals or markets or particular markets. Right, so perhaps the first thing that is important to realize when we talk about productivity in microeconomics is that it determines what we call the optimal input mix. What we mean by input mix is the best combination of resources that a firm should choose to produce when, of course, the objective is to produce at the lowest possible cost. Because in most cases, there are several ways in which a firm can produce a given level of output. For example, if we only focus on capital and labor, we could produce 100 cars with many workers and very few machines, or we could produce 100 cars with a lot of machines and very few workers. Okay, so there are different possible input combinations, input mixes, okay, to produce the same level of output. And obviously, the productivity of workers and the productivity of machines will have significance, importance, will be very important when we determine how we should produce. Of course, the productivity is not the only factor. The price of those resources will also be taken into consideration. So, for example, if machines are very productive, but if they are super expensive, well, that might not make very attractive. If labor is quite productive and very cheap, okay, maybe it's not as productive as machines, but if it's cheap, of course, that makes it relatively attractive. I'm not going to give you the exact formula to just find out what the optimal input mix is, but of course, we understand quite intuitively that this is something that, like the productivity of resources, determines the extent to which firms want to use that. Something that we discussed in class is the efficiency wage theory. Which is a theory that suggests that the productivity of workers will be higher if they receive a high wage. Basically, receiving a high wage is going to motivate, that's the basic idea, it's going to motivate workers, it's going to encourage them to make a greater effort when they are at work, and therefore, from the perspective of the business, it is something that is going to be costly because we have to give high wages, but it's something that is going to be rewarding because workers will be more productive. In fact, it doesn't really improve the productive potential of a worker, but it just ensures that the worker is going to perform to the best of his or her abilities. Something quite simple that we can explain is that in a typical supply and demand diagram, a rise in productivity will increase supply. So increased supply means shift to the right in a product market. Okay, so basically, because when resources are more productive, it means that we need less resources to produce a given quantity of output. So that leads to a reduction in the cost of production. And so if we have a lower cost of production, then we will be willing and able to produce more output at any given price. So supply is going to shift to the right. I'll graph it in a minute. And one last thing that we can say about productivity, but from the microeconomic perspective, is that a rise in productivity will increase the demand for the input. For the resource. Okay, so could be any resource, right? Could be labor, could be a machine, could be a natural resource, it doesn't really matter. We can simply focus on labor because it is the most intuitive example. Basically, what it means is that if workers become more productive, perhaps because they have more human capital, they have more skills, more experience, higher level of education. And this is something that makes them more attractive, because again, remember what we said, when workers are very productive, this encourages firms to use more workers and less of other factors of production. And if firms want to use more workers, it means that they will have to demand more labor, which is something that tends to be good for workers, because of course, as the demand for labor increases, this leads to higher wages, higher equilibrium wages, good news for workers. And at the same time, this leads to a higher equilibrium quantity of labor that is traded in the labor market, which means more jobs being created, so less unemployment. Well, then we are halfway through micro and macro. Okay. If you want to graph this 0.3 and 4, so if we have a product market, this is the initial market equilibrium. And let's say that the productivity of one of the resources that is used to produce this good or service increases. And again, like I said, this leads to a decrease in cost of production. And so the supply will increase from S1 to S2. This leads to a higher equilibrium quantity, so greater availability of the product, and at the same time, a lower price. So that's great, particularly for consumers, because the price is lower, so they can buy more. There is more availability. So this is what happens in the product market. This was point number 3. Point number 4, we can show what happens in a resource market. And to simplify, I'm just going to show the labor market. So in the labor market, so this is the quantity of labor and I'll just write WR for wage rate, say 20 francs per hour. That's a wage rate. Same thing, there is a demand for labor. Let's just call it DL1. So remember, firms are the ones who demand labor because they need labor to produce. And there is a supply of labor which comes from workers. Workers, they sell their workforce. So QL1 and WR1. Let's assume that now workers become more productive, again, perhaps because they have a higher level of education, more experience, or whatever, doesn't really matter. So that makes them more attractive from the perspective of businesses. The firm will be encouraged to use more workers and fewer of other resources, and therefore the demand for labor will increase. TL2. And this results in a high equilibrium quantity, which again is great because this means that jobs will be created and a higher wage rate, which is again good news for workers. And remember what we said earlier, usually workers that have higher productivity, and that's true for any resource, will trade at a higher price in the factor market. Okay, that's enough when it comes to productivity in microeconomics. Now let's have a look and let's try to understand the relevance of productivity in macroeconomics. Right, in macroeconomics. The study of the economy overall. Well, the productivity is very important because it basically determines the productive potential in an economy. That's right. Factor of the productivity of resources. Determines the productive potential of an economy. Basically, well, of course, it's not the only thing that determines the productive potential, but basically there are two things that will determine how much an economy can produce. How much resources we have, so the quantity, and the quality or productivity of resources, okay? So the productivity is not the only factor, but basically quantity and quality are the two things that determine how much an economy can produce. And the productivity is what measures the quality of the natural resources that we have. And of course, a country who would like to increase the productive potential of the economy if we want to increase our productive potential, one way to do this is to increase the overall productivity in the economy. If we can increase the productivity of the resources that we have. The resources. And this type of taking actions, especially from the government's perspective, taking actions that are designed to increase the productive potential, this is something that we call a supply side policy. Supply side policy. Okay, we want to increase the productive potential by shifting AS to the right. Okay, we'll look at the different models, but essentially this is what supply side policy is about. It's policy that aims at increases the productive potential. We'll see that there are different tools that can be used to achieve this target. And this is a policy that tends to be regarded as pretty effective in the sense that it can achieve the main macroeconomic objectives of the government. Okay, so remember that the productive potential of an economy is represented by the long-run aggregate supply. So again, remember in class we drew the three diagrams, like the Keynesian AS diagram, like the monetarist ASAT diagram in the short run and the long run. Obviously, if you have that type of question in the exam, you will not be expected to draw all possible cases. So if I had to choose one, and careful in the way you label the axes, here it would be real GDP or aggregate output on the day of the exam. Make sure you write everything, not just AO, or at least make sure you mention what it means, aggregate output or real GDP. And here we have the price level, PL. And if I had to choose just one diagram, I would probably choose like the long run monetarist model. So the long run aggregate supply is vertical. This is my aggregate demand, and this is YP1, which is the potential output of the economy. That of course depends on the quantity and productivity of resources. And we have the initial equilibrium price level. If the supply side policy is successful, the productive potential will increase, and the long run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right. So we move from LRAS1 to LRAS2. And you see that, of course, we're going to have a new macroeconomic equilibrium. And we can see that the level of real GDP increases. Okay, we have increased our potential output, but since in the long run we always effectively produce our potential output, this means that this economy is going to achieve economic growth. That's good, an increase in real GDP. Since we produce more, it's likely that unemployment will fall. And finally, you see that the price level decreases. So again, if we are very formal or strict, we should say that this is deflation, but usually in this model, you should interpret it as like less inflation or lower inflationary pressure. Lower inflationary pressure. So that essentially shows the impact of an increase in productivity. Of course, not just the productivity of one resource, but the productivity of resources in general in the economy. And you see why it's quite desirable, right? Because it is something that essentially allows the government to reach all primary macroeconomic objectives at once. There is no trade-off between those objectives. We can achieve them simultaneously. So it's quite good. Right, to conclude this video, let's just talk about how we do that in practice. Especially the government, we'll say a few words about the central bank, but let's just start by looking at how the government can increase the productivity of resources. Okay, so there are several ways. Most of the time it involves government spending. And there are several things, several areas on which the government can spend money. Number one, of course, education. Because it's going to boost the productivity of workers. Number two, healthcare. Because a workforce that is healthy is a workforce that is more productive. Number three, R&D, which stands for research and development. Spending money to encourage the development of new technology, new production processes, anything that is going to make the production process more efficient. So in particular, unlike these two first points that were mostly about the productivity of labor, the research and development is mostly capital. We'll also be spending on infrastructure, especially transportation and communication infrastructure that everybody can use, workers when they go to work. So this increases the geographical mobility of factors of production, which is something that basically make production more efficient, communication infrastructure that businesses use. Basically, with better infrastructure, economic agents will be more productive because they use good infrastructure. Education, healthcare, research and development infrastructure could also be, when you think about the productivity of natural resources, environmental conservation. Why? Because of course the productivity of natural resources, like a field, is very much linked to climate. And if we do not take any actions to limit the consequences of climate change, there are many areas where we will not be able to produce much agricultural commodities because the soil and the climate is not going to be conducive. Okay, so certain actions aimed at protecting the environment can help maintaining the productivity of natural resources in the long run. What else would stimulate the productivity? Give me a second to think about it. Well, that's pretty good. Okay. Well, and the central bank also. The central bank could lower interest rates. Why does this matter? I forgot one, I can include it later. Why does this matter? Because with lower rates of interest, it becomes cheaper for firms to borrow, and therefore they will be encouraged to invest. And investment, by buying new machines, by replacing older machinery by new machines, by building like state-of-the-art facilities, are likely to be more productive. So by increasing the rate of interest, investment is encouraged. I forgot something I just realized about what the government can do. I'll just add it here, which is about international trade by just facilitating the imports of resources that are productive, right? Perhaps we don't have very productive resources in our country, and by just being more open to international trade and just making sure that we can import those non-productive resources, this can increase the productivity of our economy. So facilitate the imports of productive resources. Okay, that's about it. So we know what productivity is. We know why it's relevant in microeconomics with like 4 reasons for which it's essential to understand this concept with 2 diagrams, like the product market and the resource market. And in macroeconomics, again, we understand that productivity changes will affect the productive potential of an economy, and that increasing productivity is something that will shift the aggregate supply, the longer aggregate supply to the right, and therefore leading to an increase in economic growth, fall in unemployment, and lower inflationary pressure. So it's a supply-side policy that can allow the government to achieve all macroeconomic objectives at once. And we have a list of actions that can be undertaken by the government or by the central bank, but mostly the government, to facilitate this improvement in productivity in the economy. All right, that's everything you need to know.